All right, we are looking at the last chapter that we're going to study. We're going to finish this lesson up. We started it last time. And Rushdoony is addressing the functions of the family. We asked a couple of questions, started off with what we would consider to be the functions of the family. From a human perspective, not necessarily the purposes, but what the family actually does, even if it's peripheral. So we've gone through a couple of things on that. One of the questions that we have been asking is not only do we agree or disagree with Rushdoony and why, but in this particular instance, we ask how has the state tried to usurp the functions of the family? As I was reading through this chapter, what I realized is every time Rushdoony lays out a point, a function of the family, he goes into how the state has tried to usurp it. In some cases, they have done it. In some cases, they have not, but they've at least made the attempt. Almost to the point of a nickname for the chapter of the family versus the state. But he constantly goes back, and it's very much a treatise on the state trying to usurp the family in both authority and in its function. So just to fast forward a little bit and remind us of what we discussed last week, we talked about how the family is the central institution of law and in society, how so much of our law and so much of our society does revolve around acknowledging the family unit. Even in the case of our tax code, the federal government in our income taxes recognizes a family unit and has codes that specifically addresses it, giving benefit to that. We also talked about how the family is the institution for the procreation and rearing of children. That's the only way a nuclear family, traditional mom-dad, is the only way that you end up with kids. Certainly the only way to healthily raise them. Though the state and other perverts are trying to say that's not necessarily the case. But as someone who has grown up in a homosexual family, I can tell you there's nothing healthy about it. Both in my case and for the case of every other child that I knew who was raised in a similar situation. Been there.
Tell us how you felt that hurt you.
Everyone understands typical teenage angst, right? I mean, every teenager is trying to find their identity. When you don't have a proper, in my case, a father figure, as a young man growing up, I didn't know what manhood looked like. And I had two women trying to tell me what it would look like. They don't know. Not the way a man does. Add on top of that the teenage assumption from my peers that because my mom was gay, so was I. They thought it was genetic. It's not. But it doesn't keep teenagers from picking on the ones that they think are. Not to mention the case, in my particular case, my stepmom was abusive. Emotionally, verbally, physically, until I put a stop to it. And that is also the case for a lot of step-family situations, but in most homosexual step-family situations, parents are abusive. The partner is abusive. That is not at all unusual.
Your biological mother didn't protect you?
No, not in the least. Still isn't. One of the things that I've noticed for both male and female homosexual couples, for the dedicated couples, there is almost always a more feminine and a more masculine, and they are very easily recognized. In my case, my mom was the feminine side. Her partner, Diane, is the masculine side. And it's usually the masculine side that's going to be abusive, especially when it's cross-gender. Just things that I've seen from experience, from my own, from those around me who were in similar situations. I had a number of friends whose parents were homosexual. Out of all of them, even including my biological brother, as far as I know, I'm the only one that God decided ought to be reasonably sane, if you can call me reasonably sane. But we're all messed up. We were all messed up. I was saved by God's grace. Most of them were not. At least not for the time that I knew them.
Adam help with the, I don't know how to say it. Was he very supportive, or did
Uncle
you
Adam?
support each other?
Honestly, not very much. He didn't know to, and I didn't know how to. Not at the time, not when we both lived with Grandma. John?
You talked about the abusive situation, in a situation where you were going into it as the children of your mother, and now she's got a new partner. And in step-family situations, that's often the way that happens. Now,
Yes.
in our society, we have couples who are adopting from the very beginning. Is it the same, do you have any statistics on the abuse in those situations? Is it the same, is it different, is more or less prevalent? What kind, I mean, it's inherently abusive to the child because they don't have a regular, normal family, but
I don't know that there are a lot of statistics out there right now for two reasons. One, this idea of homosexual couples adopting is relatively new. That has not been allowed for very long. There was a time, even when I was growing up, just a decade ago, where judges, by and large, would have said absolutely not. Absolutely not. That was even a time when they didn't really want single potential parents adopting. It had to be a mother and father. No longer the case on that either. So it hasn't been happening long enough for anyone to have really done good research on it. I also don't think anybody wants to know. The homosexual agenda, exactly, the researchers are going to turn their head on this. Even when there is enough time and enough instances, the homosexual agenda, nobody wants to cross it. And so they're not going to do that research. I hope I'm wrong, but that would be my suspicion. If I had to take a guess, I think in situations where it's a couple that adopt together, it will be less physically abusive and less verbally abusive. But I think it will be just as emotionally abusive because those same families are not going to encourage a proper gender identity. Because you have sexual identity and gender identity now all tied into one agenda. And it's when you've got women pretending to be men and men pretending to be women when they're in a homosexual relationship, they don't have a good gender identity themselves. And so that is going to be emotionally abusive, at best neglectful. So I think it will be abusive. I think it will have a different face to it. Any other thoughts on this? Dan?
I have read statistics on the quote-unquote transgender, people who identify as transgender or whatever, of extremely high suicide rates.
Extremely.
And also in homosexuals as well, that the suicide rate is much higher than in somebody who is hetero. I hate these terms, but anyways, yeah.
Got to talk about it somehow.
Yeah, exactly. So wouldn't it follow, even if there's not statistics already out there, wouldn't it follow that if they go ahead and allow them to adopt homosexuals and these transgender, that the instability that's clearly already with them will be passed on to their children, or their children will be influenced by it.
Yeah, the idea that someone so unstable as those in homosexual relationships or those in a transgender identity, if they are that unstable, how can they then stably raise a child? It doesn't follow. It's going to fall apart. Okay, if there's an exception to that, it is by God's grace, and it would be the exception to the rule. It's not going to prove out statistically. Anything else on this? In this, we very much see the state usurping the family and undermining it because the state is all on board with letting anyone and everyone raise children.
It's a way to keep the masses in control, is what it is. The more unstable people that you have that have to rely on the government, the better they are.
Right. The more they control.
So,
The more they control. We also talked a little bit about how the family functions as man's first and basic school. Not the only school, but it is the first school. It's the first place that children begin to learn. We talked a little bit about how moms, with raising an infant, staying at home with them all the time, teach this child who literally knows nothing but sin, and teaches them how to communicate, how to talk. They don't know, they have no concept of language, and yet you teach them language. It's an example that Rushdoony brings out, but it's not just language that is taught. It's tradition, it's habits, all kinds of things that are taught in the home by the family, like how to eat quietly. So, the family does serve as man's first and most basic school. Not that it's limited to basics, and not that it's the only. Any thoughts on this before we move on?
Well, this is borne out again and again. I mean, if a child has a solid home and never goes to school, the child will probably be fine. But if he has no home at all, doesn't matter what kind of grade school you put him in,
Right, it's going to be a mess.
it's going to be horrible. See it again and again.
I don't recall if we addressed this in depth at all, but the family also functions or serves as the first government in the life of the child. We're talking about matters of authority and governance. How do we see this played out? Do we agree here? Do we disagree?
Well, you're going to get government sometime. So if the family doesn't serve as the first government, then I feel sorry for whoever is the first government. Because it's going to be a problem.
Right. Because every other government assumes that there's some understanding of authority.
I mean, you see it with all the protests, with things going on in Berkeley, going on in liberal places. I mean, they grew up without government in their homes, so then they go to school, and then they go to college, and you, because Trump, I mean, is the president, you're going to bring in, trauma puppies and, parrots and birds.
Safe spaces.
Safe spaces? I mean, come on.
Yeah.
They were never taught right from wrong and to respect, people.
John?
One of the things we often talk about here when we talk about the governments is we talk about the first and most important government is self-government, and then there's family government, and then there's church government, and there's civil government. But truly, you have a family government is primary because you can't have self-government from infant on up.
Right. It has to be taught.
It has to be taught. And so it is, in many, many ways, the family government is primary, not self-government. You won't have self-government if you never had family.
No, and we see examples on the college campuses right now.
That's what you're talking about, yeah.
We see that play
I
out.
mean, eventually you get to self-government. If you're saved, you will learn to govern yourself. But
But even then, it still has to be taught
It's still-
somewhere.
That's right.
That's the idea of discipleship in a church context. It's the idea of discipline in a family context. When we discipline our children, we are teaching them government. That is what we're teaching.
Aiming at self-government.
Aiming at self-government. Conrad, did you have something?
My dad almost always would say before he spanked me, is that
abusive.
for the rest of your life, if you don't govern yourself, somebody else is going to govern you. He would always say that. Those who do not govern themselves will be governed by others. And then he would spank me.
That's a great lesson.
It only happened like once, that's why you remember it.
Yeah, but that always instilled in my mind, if I don't govern myself, somebody else is going to.
Someone
So
else.
I better learn some
That's a great point.
self-government.
That's a great lesson.
Government will happen.
That's right.
There will be government.
I think it is, because we have to teach children maybe not to tear books and not to tear posters and
Right.
letters.
You're teaching them what is proper and what is improper.
And you had to be taught the same thing.
It's, it's interesting too, just to see the different ways in which, especially children, learn about government, because like next door to us, we have three children, all of the same mother, but all have different fathers. And we just went through it with this week, because two of the others were with their fathers. The other one was not, wanted by the father this week. So was home. But it's interesting to see how they come back and there's this interaction of, well, I had a different set of government here. Now I'm coming to this place and it's different government here. And that's different government than what my sibling had or has. And then the third sibling has different government because and they begin to learn, well, certain forms of government can be manipulated in certain ways and for certain benefits, and certain offer different privileges that others don't. And so even their sense of government is getting skewed because they're not even understanding and getting a model of what true government is.
And that points out the beauty of all being governed by one government, which is where peace comes from. Of the increase of his government and peace is what Isaiah 9 says. If his government increases and everybody's playing by the same rule book, there will be an increase of peace.
Yep.
It's a beautiful thing as God designed it. And it's a horrible thing that as we've made a hash of.
It is amazing what consistency will do.
Oh.
We see it especially in the lives of children as they're learning government, but even for adults. Even as we see different levels of government playing by different rules that we have to figure out how to manage within that or manipulate it to get around it. Especially when we're looking at governments that are ungodly and unjust and illegitimate. Any other thoughts on this point? The first government in the life of a child. Point number 5. The family functions or serves as motivation and guidance. I still have in mind specifically for children, but not just for children, even for the adults in a family. Agree, disagree? Why? Then why?
Because sometimes I don't want to go to karate, but once I didn't want to go to karate, and I said, why don't, and Mom got me to put on my gi, and I was glad because we played sudo that night.
She gave you some motivation
And guidance.
and some guidance. Yeah.
How's governance different than motivation and guidance?
Good question.
Because you whoop somebody's butt, that's motivation.
I don't know. I would disagree with that.
Okay.
I think that there's a form of motivation there. Motivation to not infract that rule again because of discipline. But I don't know that that's the same thing as, like, the intent here, I think, is motivation to do what's right for the sake of it being right, and guidance on perhaps how best to accomplish things, you know, again, for like a child. They don't fully always understand how to do the things that you know will be right and good for them. And so you give them guidance, and the motivation, I believe, comes along with I guess this is more of a positive. Whereas I look at government, to me, is, and I think Joel said this well, government is teaching them no. Government should really only be in play, I believe, to teach them no. No, and discipline and enforcing law. Motivation and guidance I see as the positive side. So to me, governance this is the negative side of, this is a rule infraction and this is the discipline for that. Motivation and guidance is the positive side of encouraging and driving one to proper action without going into the realm of government. I don't know.
Okay.
You can interact on that.
I think as an example here, it's not about children, it's about me. As a servant leader in my home, I am motivated to dry the dishes and put the dishes away. If I lived as a bachelor, they would stack, right? Now, is that against the law? No. But I am motivated because I know that pleases my wife. You know, to have a neat countertop, to have the dish drainer cleared, that's a family thing that provides me with motivation. As an example, that's not governance in the sense of discipline. Although I'm exercising discipline,
That's true.
it's not a discipline it's not gonna hurt if I don't put the dishes away.
I mean, I think Dave's right. There is motivation and guidance in governance too. So I think it's maybe how do we term this? That
Right.
we can make that distinction.
Or perhaps
'Cause
two sides of the same
Because
coin.
when I think governance, I would agree. There is some motivation and guidance there, and that don't do this because it nets this result. But I would see that as fundamentally different than the motivation and guidance of what John's saying, a positive. So I don't know if there's a different way to word it. I don't know.
Perhaps, just perhaps, another way to look at it is maybe governance is about law and morality, and motivation and guidance, though does address that, may also address things that are not about law and morality. So, another example. Annie and I are very much encouraging our kids, even now, toward owning their own business. Whatever it is, they want to be plumbers or landscapers or run a mobile tea house. None of those things are right or wrong. It's not a question of morality, but we are encouraging them or guiding them into business ownership. Whether they own their own business or work for someone else isn't right or wrong, but we are trying to motivate them in a certain direction for good reasons, and give them guidance, help them figure out how to do it if that's what they're going to do. And if it's not what they're going to do, help them figure out what that is going to be.
I guess I would look at that as part of governance, motivation and guidance. But yeah, in the general scheme of governance, you are governing, directing.
You're enforcing, like governance is enforcing. My governance with my children is a non-negotiable. I am enforcing on you this rule and this penalty, and there is no appeals court here. Like, this is what it is, and this is the judgment coming down on you, and I am enforcing law, and I'm teaching you no, and the consequences of action, which I would agree with Sid, is more of about a moral issue. You have broken more, like I don't discipline my children for for a lack of understanding. I discipline my children for a lack of obedience. You know what I mean? Like, if they have a lack of understanding, I'm looking to motivate and guide them. Motivate them to that which is right, and then guide them in how to do it. So, like, I don't know, I don't know. For me, I think governments, I understand it to be more about enforcing law and that which is trying to infringe on law. And so, I guess maybe that motivates it. But again, I want to motivate and guide them to do the right thing, not because they don't want to get disciplined, but to do the right thing because it is pleasing to God, and that is their reasonable service. I don't know.
Conrad?
So it's pretty clear to me how you would do governance in the negative side, at least in the negative side of things. Like saying how
Right.
punishment. So how do you motivate children or basically?
I think that's one of the beauties of this being a function of the family and not of the church or the civil government. Because that may be very different from one child to the next. From one family to the next, but even within one family, I'm going to motivate and guide Bruce differently from Stella, differently from Libby, differently from Jack. Now,
A child in the way he should go.
You're familiar with behaviorism, so you have positive and negative reinforcement.
right?
Is that what we're doing? Do something right, give them a piece of candy, or is that a good way of doing it, or how do I motivate?
I think it can be one of what those positive and negatives are. May be different from one child to the next. One child may need more positives or negatives based on their behavior than another. That's going to depend on personality and the goal. Dan, did you have something?
No, that's great.
John?
The piece of candy idea, to my mind, that is manipulative. On the other hand, you could set up the candy as a goal and have them work toward that goal. That would be motivation.
Okay.
When something happens that you are pleased by, handing them a piece of candy to reinforce it is just manipulative in my mind.
How's the difference?
Well,
They're going with the goal of getting the candy.
except that they didn't know the candy was on the table. They didn't know the candy was a possibility. It's
Okay.
that, it's.
How do they know that the candy's a possibility if that's the goal?
Oh, I'm saying, if you set it up as the goal, if you set it up, say, if you work towards this, you will, at the end of it, if you achieve it, you will achieve this candy.
Okay.
That's setting it up, whereas simply giving it to them because, well, that was great behavior, you kissed grandma without my prompting as you were leaving, and so I'm gonna give you a piece of candy. That's just manipulative, now the kids,
Next time they kiss grandma, they're gonna be wondering,
You're gonna expect
Right.
it.
Yeah,
am I gonna get this or
that
not?
kind of thing. Dan, you were, I'm sorry.
Yeah, to what you were saying, how they didn't know that the candy was on the table at first. Sometimes I do that with Madeline, like if she's good on her own accord or obedient on her own accord for a day or something, I'll say, you did very well today, and I'll give her something. But didn't the Lord with Israel, I mean, he said, if you obey me, this is what I'm going to do to you. If you disobey me, this is what I'm going to do. And he gave specifics on blessings and specifics on curses. So would you call that behaviorism in a way? I mean,
Those were goals. Those were set up ahead of time.
they were clear-cut
Yeah.
motivations for rewards
understand,
and curses.
Right. I understand, I'm cutting a fine point.
Oh, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying.
I think you're walking on the tip of a knife blade when you're having this conversation.
Yeah. very much.
What's so hard is that, when we talk about, like, when we start factoring in that each child is different, each child has different needs, each child's makeup. I mean, the way in which I discipline fairly, but I have to be careful because with certain children, there is a level of volume that I need to achieve with them so that that particular child understands, oh, he's serious about this. Whereas with another child, if I do that, I will destroy them. I will literally destroy my child because they can hear nothing I say after that because the only thing they've received is, oh my word, he is so angry and disappointed in me, and it just, I'm done. I have lost the ability to govern with any sort of real effect at that point. And so I have to learn how I'm interacting with each, how I motivate each, how I'm guiding each. There isn't a cookie cutter answer to it. I mean, the reality, I think, is that with some kids, if I say to one of my children, if you do X behavior, I'll give you X, thing, they'd be like, that's not motivation to me. I don't care about that at all. Like, you just don't care. I cannot go across the board and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. So I do have to motivate and guide in a way that is understanding each child and the way that God has crafted them. Because they all have such different personalities and such different giftings, and they exhibit that in such different ways. So, is it behaviorism? I think to some degree there's always going to be what might seem as behaviorism. But like, here's the thing, I do think it is important, and sometimes, I think in Reformed circles especially, sometimes we can get so into the law and upholding the law that we forget to truly praise our children for comprehending and doing that which is right. I do it for my children different times. Was that good? Did I do right? They're looking for affirmation. They need to know that their father approves of them and is delighted in them. And I don't think that is ungodly. Because what is it that we should be able to stand in, even in our failures as Christians, is our Father still delights in us because we are acceptable to Him. Now, granted, that's because of Christ, but we're acceptable to the Father. And our children must also learn that lesson. Because I'll tell you right now, you can do all the discipline you want, but if you don't motivate and guide your children, that discipline will mean nothing. All you are at that point to them is a tyrant, and as soon as they can get out from under your tyrannical rule, they will be out and they will look for another source of law. Guaranteed. If they don't know that there's acceptance there, and there's affirmation of, I do approve of what you do within the context of God's law, then I don't think that the discipline means anything except here.
Behaviorism is this idea of, it's a good way of
Well,
explaining it.
you could view it as a man is like a machine, and depending what you put in, it's going to determine what you get out. So if you put in one thing, you're always going to get another thing out. So it denies that there's any sort of soul to man that makes its own decisions, basically.
Does that make some sense? Thank you. Jeff?
I think in my experience as the one who objectively got the most spankings within my
Objectively.
objectively, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Dad, but I never tried to do good things for a piece of candy. Like, I just, as a child, I just tried to please my parents so I didn't get a spanking. That was just enough motivation for me, I don't know if that helps anybody, but I just didn't want a spanking, so I tried to do what my parents asked me to do, even if it's a piece of candy or not.
My point right there.
Yeah.
But I do question though, should that be our goal as parents? That I want my kids to do right because I want them to be afraid
I'm
of
not
getting
gonna
spanked.
judge Joel, he didn't.
Now you're criticizing the pastor.
But I don't because I don't really know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pastor, but I don't think the motivation was I'm going to have them be afraid of getting spanked, and that's why they're going to do right.
Or was sitting here quiet the whole
Or
time?
was it or is it my goal is to motivate and guide them to do right and teach them what the consequences of wrong is. My goal should be that they desire to do right because it pleases God. not because they don't want spankings. They want to do what's right because it's God's law. And that's gonna have a lot to do with how we discipline, and that's why, like, you know, I had to get to the point where I started learning, wow, I'm setting up a really bad habit when I discipline my kids, and I just say, well, this is what you did, and I don't like it, and I said no, so this is what's gonna happen, because that's what happened to me, and the only thing that bred in me was, oh, so mom and dad make the rules, so I can't wait till I'm old enough to make my own rules, and then I don't have to worry about it. Instead, I tried now to be intentional to say, this is what you did. This is what God's word says about what you did, and then this is the consequence of that. Because the goal should not be that we want our children to be obedient because they don't want spankings. I'm not saying that's not going to happen. No, none of us parent perfectly, but I would think that we want our goal to be, we motivate and guide them to obey God because it's obedience to God.
That's your ultimate goal, but you're gonna,
Certain ages, you're not gonna get that.
you're not getting that at
I get
certain
that.
ages.
I get that, but
What you need is their attention.
Yes.
And so by establishing punishment at an early age, in obedience to just dad, you get their ear, so that at some point you can teach what you just talked about, so that you have their ear, that they will hear you. In the case of our own son, we would say, if you do this, you will get spanked. Now, we were Christians at that time, but we could watch him think it through and say, I'll take the spanking. And he did. You know, not that he didn't come up with a very finely tuned sense of right and wrong, although not biblical necessarily. You know, he did, but he would, from an early age, would think that through and take it with a smile.
Yeah.
I am not getting through this kid. I'm sorry, you were going to say.
No, that's all right. Yeah, the age thing is what I think unlocks the situation here. When they're really small, you're not going to explain much to them about the way the world works. It's do this because I said so. So the process of parenting, it seems to me, is a process of saying, do this because I said so at the early age. At the end, do this because God said so at the end of it. So you're transmitting that. In the beginning, though, there are certain things that they just have to obey you because you're dad and they're not.
Right.
You know, out on the street, you're gonna get killed.
Right.
You know, and
Fingers in the outlets.
yeah, you're not gonna put your finger in the outlets. You don't understand electricity, whatever. Here's what you are gonna understand. I'm gonna help you be motivated not to do that. And later on, they'll get it, and you'll be able to have those conversations. What I would caution any parent about is starting that conversation perhaps too early. Here's why I say that. Too early, not ever. If they learn how to obey you and respect you, now you have that platform for that conversation. But it seems to me if you start too early, it's what I call discipline by discussion.
Henry called it death by lecture.
Yeah, death by lecture, same thing, right? It's this long, drawn-out thing, you know, and so many times I've seen parents do this. You know, we don't, now, little Johnny, we don't do that because the man doesn't like it. You know, this is not new information the child needs. Child don't care if a man doesn't like it or not. And it's almost like the parent's like, well, hey, you know, we'll tell him this new information, and then the child will be motivated to do what I'm saying. No, it's not about that. If the child does not learn how to respect the parent at an early age, I think you're going to have a hard time having that platform to be able to talk to them properly later on. But really, you do have to get to that point where, you know what, I'm only mom and dad, we're going to be here for a while, we'll always be your parents, but the day is coming when you're going to be your own parent, and you are going to have to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, apart from us.
You're talking about the transition from family government to self-government.
That's what you're talking about.
That's the goal.
And for some people, that might be 5 years old, some it might be 14.
Exactly.
some never
That's
get.
the beauty of the
With
family.
That whole thing, you know, I quit staying at my brother-in-law's place down in Maryland because of that. At 2 o'clock in the morning, little kid's being a brat. She's over there lecturing her about how Uncle Dave, wants to get some sleep. So I quit staying there, and now it's a huge deal because I don't go to their house anymore. But yeah.
I say, see, discipline by discussion. Don't do that because Uncle Dave doesn't like it. Because I cannot motivate you myself. Not gonna be motivated. So,
There's an underlying principle that I found. With children, young children especially, what they understand is actions, consequences. And they have to be directly connected, and those consequences have to be painful, physically painful. Because they can understand physical pain.
yeah.
A swat on the backside, they get it. They don't like it. Once you've established actions and consequences, then when they're a little older, they can understand actions and delayed consequences, and actions and abstract consequence. But you have to start with something they already understand, physical pain. That's why the scriptures say, spank your kids. And that is part of motivation, and it is a governance. Again, Dave, I don't know that we can say that they are exactly the same thing, but you are correct in that at the very least they are very closely tied. Now,
Just one last thing about this, because it's critical. You never get to that self-government.
1 minute over.
Yeah, and I was actually a quarter of.
you said it.
Yeah, I said that. But if and this parental thing where you're not trying to get them to self-governance, and the only way you discipline your child is this punishment of "you're bothering me" type thing, which it sounds like you got this from your step-parent, whatever you want to call it, was going on. You'll never get to the self-government part, because from the very beginning, you're trying to do that. You're trying to encourage the child. You're trying to encourage those discussions about what God, there is a great God who governs everything. You're trying to get there. You'll never get there if all you do is punish through reaction. And you're bugging me now, kid, so now I'm going to light you up. You'll
When that's
never
the
get there.
standard.
Yep. You won't make it.
And I think that's what I'm getting at, is when they begin to associate, oh, if I act this way, then I'm gonna get spanked, so I just won't act that way. That to me feels so much more reactionary based than, okay, I know that this is the consequence for this, because at least according to mom and dad, this is wrong because of, So yeah, that's what I'm getting at, is I just think that reactionary, I'm not gonna do that, because I know if I do that, I'll just get yelled at, or I'll just get a spanking, or I'll just get, I don't know.
It is motivation, it is governance. But again, I think motivation can be beyond just the negative side, that governance, that punishment side of it. In this, just to wrap it up, how do we see government usurping the family's role in this motivation and guidance, both positive and negative?
Try to spank your kid at Walmart to impose governance and see if the state has anything to say about it.
That's CPS knocking on your door. That's CPS knocking at your door. So here's an interesting for instance to address the lacking qualification of civil government to try to guide outside its purview of limiting wrongdoing, of punishing evil. And when they go outside of that, they fall apart. And here's one reason why. A couple years ago, well, everybody's familiar with the diet tree, the food pyramid, right? We all grew up with that. I had that. Pretty simple layout. One, if you look at the newest one, It's so convoluted, it's ridiculous. But in that pyramid, they tell you that it is better for you to go eat Frosted Flakes, which I love, by the way. But they say those are better for you than avocados, fresh, off-the-tree avocados. Yes. Thank you, Conrad. So you've got a civil government telling you to eat the sugary sweet cornflakes instead of avocados because they have deemed it more healthy. And anyone with any common sense understands that that is not the case. So when it comes to their guidance, 'cause that's what that's supposed to be, that food pyramid, that guidance is well outside their purview, and we see that once again, they can't get it right.
I think some of you might be aware, my nephew, his daughter has Dravet syndrome, which is seizures, where the state Child Protective Services deemed that they were not calling the ambulance in, they're supposed to call the ambulance within 5 minutes, not 15 minutes. Sometimes her seizures only lasted 5 minutes. So why bother the ambulance? But Child Protective Services came in, got them all in trouble. They had to go to Harrisburg. They had a hearing on May the 5th, and they still have not heard the ruling.
What's being decided?
Child abuse.
Then like they'll get a fine?
They would get put on the abuse list, medical neglect list. Because they did not call the ambulance within the arbitrary, whatever time that the Child Protective...
Some bureaucrat decided was...
Oh, no, it's completely arbitrary. Like, it's, well, you should call them within 5 minutes.
Right, it's not written down someplace.
No.
So, yeah, some bureaucrat decided. Arbitrarily.
On the fly.
Yeah.
Right.
So, there's a prime example of perfect example.
I saw a video on the internet just yesterday of a teenager arrested at his home, had been chased down by the police because he was riding his bicycle without a helmet. He ran home, wouldn't stop for them, knowing he was going to be kidnapped, into the protection of his house. And they finally convinced his parents to send him outside just for the citation. And as soon as he came out, they cuffed him and took him off. Protecting that teenager from himself for not wearing a helmet while he's riding a bicycle on the street.
Version? Kidnapping?
Does that mean I could get kidnapped for riding my bike up and down the sidewalk, which I know because I've lived here for 3 years?
Understand that we are talking about being kidnapped by the police, and yes, that is a risk.
This was a teenager?
Teenager.
Growing up in a government school with a mom that pretended to be a good citizen by government standards, and sure she was, I was always taught, trust the police. You can always trust the cops. But more and more, we see as the enforcers of ungodly law and abusers of of usurped authority and power. That's simply not always the case. The state of our policing in this country is an example of a usurpation. They are now the motivators. They are the ones who guide on the streets, where the legislation hits our doorsteps. They're the ones who do it, and we just can't trust them anymore. That's a problem. It's a problem that as Christians we have allowed to happen. But we have a profound problem on top of that. They've got more and bigger guns. But it is high time that we start thinking about addressing that very directly.
What you're talking about is a religious issue. The humanism of civil government is a religion. Violation of their religion is rigidly enforced.
Right?
And that's what's going, and that's what we're dealing with here. It's a violation against the state rules that has teenagers arrested from within their homes for not riding their bicycles in a way that the state deems proper. That is a violation against the state. That is a religious infraction, and it's being punished. That-
One more reminder.
It's a religious issue.
This is a religious issue. As much as any humanist will deny it, it is. Stella?
Is it partly because of the cops that you have recently know how to use a gun?
That's one among many. One among many, many. All right, we are going to cut it off there. Unless there are any other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, or rebuttals, let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for Rushdoony, for the work that he did, for the study that he did, for the teaching that he did, for the work that you've done through him. We thank you for this work, this piece that we could walk through a couple chapters and think about a few issues that certainly don't come up in other churches and that are on our hearts and minds more and more as they ought to be. We understand that asking the right questions is a start. And we pray that as we continue on daily, weekly, you would continue to reveal to us answers to the questions you have us asking. And not just answers but to the questions, but wisdom in how to make those answers the reality here and now in your kingdom. What's our role in establishing that here? Thank you that you've given us guys like Rushdoony to help us think through these things and ask these right questions. But let us not be content to stop there. Because we live for you and your kingdom. And we thank you for that privilege. We love you. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.